October 24, 2024. Johnson Space Center, Houston, Texas. Archive Vault C7, Sublevel 2. 52-year-old NASA astronaut Owen Bradshaw, 3 shuttle missions, 498 cumulative days in orbit, was supposed to be looking for publicity materials. The agency needed footage for the 55th anniversary documentary of Apollo 12. Nothing classified, nothing controversial. Just old launch photos and crew portraits to make the public relations department happy. What he found instead was a magnetic tape labeled Apollo 12-Com Check-November 1969. Standard archival box, standard catalog sticker, filed between telemetry data and soil sample documentation. Except the catalog number was wrong. Owen had spent 6 months working with the Apollo archive during his post-flight assignment in 2022. He knew the numbering system. Com checks were communication tests, routine and brief, typically 3 to 7 minutes of recorded transmission to verify equipment function before and after critical mission phases. This tape's catalog designation suggested a standard systems verification, but the handwritten notation in the corner, barely visible, faded blue ink from a felt-tip pen, said 14 minutes 47 seconds. No com check in Apollo history ran that long. Owen signed out the tape, walked it to the digitization lab, and asked Marlene Chen, the archive's senior technical specialist, 34 years with NASA, trained in magnetic media preservation and forensic audio recovery, to transfer the contents to digital format. She set up the Studer A810 reel-to-reel, calibrated for 1969-era NASA tape stock, and pressed play. What came through the monitors was Commander Pete Conrad's voice. Owen recognized it immediately. He'd listened to hundreds of hours of Apollo audio during his research. Conrad's distinctive Philadelphia accent, the slight nasal quality, the rapid-fire delivery that made Mission Control constantly ask him to slow down. But this wasn't in the official transcripts. Conrad's voice, timestamp 06:34:12 Universal Time Coordinated, November 19, 1969, during the first extravehicular activity of Apollo 12, came through clear and methodical. He was describing equipment deployment, specifically the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, the ALSEP Array, a collection of scientific instruments designed to measure seismic activity, solar wind, and magnetic fields. Standard procedures. Nothing unusual. Until minute 4, when Conrad's tone shifted. Not panic. Astronauts don't panic. But something else. Precision. The kind of careful articulation that comes when someone is documenting something they know is important and wants every word preserved exactly. "Houston," Conrad said, "we're getting a signal. Structured. Repeating pattern. Origin appears to be subsurface, approximately 2.7 kilometers below current position, bearing 270 degrees from the ALSEP Central Station. Frequency is 1,420 megahertz." Marlene stopped the playback. She looked at Owen. "The frequency of hydrogen," she said. "The universal wavelength. The one frequency every radio astronomer agrees would be the logical choice for interstellar communication, because hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. If someone wanted to signal across space, that's the frequency they'd use. That's the frequency we've been listening for since SETI started." Owen asked her to continue. Conrad's voice resumed. "Pattern consists of prime number sequence," he reported. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, continuing up to 97. Then pause. Exactly 1,420 seconds. Then repetition. No variation detected across 4 complete cycles. This is not equipment interference. This is not random. This is structured communication. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, Conrad providing technical specifications, electromagnetic readings, signal strength measurements, antenna orientation data. Then it cut. Abruptly. Mid-sentence. No static. No fade. Just immediate silence. The kind of silence that comes when someone physically stops a recording device. Marlene ran the metadata analysis. Tape stock matched NASA procurement records from 1968. Magnetic signature consistent with 1969-era recording equipment. Spectral voice analysis against confirmed Pete Conrad samples showed 99.4% match probability. Background noise profile matched lunar surface acoustic characteristics, the absolute absence of atmospheric sound that only exists in vacuum. Everything verified. The recording was authentic, but it wasn't in any official Apollo 12 archive. Owen asked Marlene to check the catalog code again, the full designation, including the internal classification markers that most researchers ignored because they were administrative artifacts from the filing system. She pulled up the complete record. The code included a prefix that hadn't transferred to the label, a prefix that required her to access a separate database, one that tracked materials under special handling protocols. Project Sentinel appeared on her screen. Classification level. Eyes only. Status. No official record. A project that, according to every public NASA document, congressional testimony, and Freedom of Information Act response for the last 55 years, never existed. Owen made 3 calls that afternoon. The first was to Dr. Raymond Hayes, 61 years old, professor of astrophysics at MIT, former consultant to the Deep Space Network, specialist in radio astronomy and interplanetary communication protocols, the kind of person who could look at signal data and tell you not just what it was, but what it meant. Hayes arrived at Johnson Space Center 2 days later with portable spectrum analysis equipment and 40 years of experience detecting things that weren't supposed to exist. He spent 6 hours in the audio lab with Marlene, running the recording through every verification protocol in his extensive toolkit, cross-referencing the voice pattern against NASA's archived Conrad samples, analyzing the electromagnetic signature of the tape itself, examining the spectral characteristics of the background noise for any indication of artificial manipulation or modern fabrication. When he finished, he removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes in the way people do when they've just confirmed something they wish they hadn't, and delivered his assessment in the careful language of someone who understood that words like authentic and verified carry weight in scientific discourse. The recording was genuine, he said, laid down on magnetic tape in November 1969, using equipment consistent with Apollo-era technology. The voice was Pete Conrad, probability exceeding statistical certainty. The background acoustic profile matched lunar surface recordings with characteristics that couldn't be replicated in any Earth-based studio. The complete absence of atmospheric reverberation, the particular quality of radio transmission in hard vacuum. And the signal Conrad described, the mathematical pattern, the precise frequency, the repetition interval, all of it was documented with the kind of technical accuracy that only comes from direct observation. Conrad wasn't reading from a script, Hayes concluded. He was reporting what he saw. The second call Owen made was to Garrett Fisher, 79 years old, retired NASA communications technician who'd worked Capcom, the capsule communicator position, during Apollo 12. Fisher lived in Clear Lake, 15 minutes from the Space Center, in a house filled with mission patches and signed photographs and the accumulated documentation of a career spent listening to people talk from space. Owen drove there on a Thursday afternoon, sat in Fisher's kitchen, and played him the recording without context. Fisher listened for 30 seconds before his expression changed. He held up one hand, asking Owen to stop the playback, and sat there in silence for nearly a minute before speaking. "I remember this," Fisher said, and his voice carried the weight of 55 years of not talking about something. November 19th, Pete's first EVA. "We were monitoring from Houston, standard comm protocols, everything nominal. And then, suddenly, Pete starts reporting this signal, this pattern, and the flight director, I won't say his name, but you can look up who was on console that day. He ordered an immediate hold on the public feed. Cut the live broadcast. Switched Pete to private loop. I heard maybe 2 minutes of it before they pulled me off console, told me it was equipment malfunction, interference from the lunar module's systems, told me to log it as technical anomaly and move on. But Pete's voice, the way he was talking, that wasn't malfunction. That was the voice of someone who'd found something and knew exactly how significant it was. Pete Conrad flew fighter jets off carriers in combat. He'd landed on the moon. The man didn't get rattled. But that day, I heard something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not fear exactly. Something else. Recognition, maybe. Like he understood he was standing on top of something that changed everything we thought we knew. The third call Owen made was to Dr. Chloe Park, 42 years old, astrophysicist with the SETI Institute, specialist in mathematical signal analysis and pattern recognition in electromagnetic transmissions. She'd spent 2 decades searching for exactly the kind of structured communication Conrad described. Owen sent her the digital transfer, the full 14 minutes 47 seconds, along with Conrad's technical specifications and Hayes's authentication report. She called him back 4 hours later. Her voice on the phone was quiet, controlled, the way scientists sound when their data is showing them something impossible, and they're triple-checking their methodology before saying it out loud. "The pattern," she said, "prime numbers 2 through 97. Pause of exactly 1,420 seconds. Repetition. That's not random. That's not natural. That's intentional communication using mathematical universals. But here's what doesn't make sense. The specific structure, the way the numbers are grouped, the pause interval, even the frequency selection, it's all consistent with the communication protocols we'd propose today for interstellar contact. It matches theoretical frameworks we've developed over the last 40 years, which would be remarkable but explainable if this signal was detected yesterday. But this was 1969. We hadn't formalized these protocols yet. Hell, SETI wasn't even officially founded until 1984. She paused, and Owen could hear papers rustling, computer keys clicking. "And there's something else," Park continued. "The content. Those specific prime numbers, that exact sequence, the pause duration. I've seen this pattern before. Not from space, from us. This matches elements of the Voyager Golden Record, the collection of sounds and images we sent into interstellar space in 1977. The mathematical primer we included to help any potential finder decode the record's contents. But Owen, the Voyager probes weren't launched until August and September of 1977. This recording is from November 19th, 1969. That's 8 years before we created the thing this signal appears to be responding to." Dr. Park flew to Houston 3 days later, carrying a laptop and a level of professional concern that manifested as methodical precision. She sat with Owen and Hayes in a conference room at Johnson Space Center and walked them through her analysis step by step, displaying signal wave forms and mathematical breakdowns on a projection screen with the kind of careful pedagogy that comes before delivering conclusions no one wants to hear. The Voyager Golden Record, she began, was assembled by a committee chaired by Carl Sagan between 1976 and 77. It contains 116 images, greetings in 55 languages, sounds from Earth, 90 minutes of music, and a mathematical primer designed to help any finder decode the record's contents. That primer uses prime numbers as a universal mathematical constant, the same sequence Conrad reported hearing, 2 through 97, because prime numbers are fundamental to mathematics, regardless of what biology or culture develops that mathematics. The pause interval in the lunar signal, 1,420 seconds. That's not arbitrary. Convert that to minutes, and you get 23.67, which is incredibly close to the duration of Earth's axial tilt, 23.4 degrees, another universal constant that any scientifically literate civilization observing our planet would recognize. These aren't coincidences. This is structured communication using universals. But here's what makes it impossible. She pulled up two side-by-side spectrograms, one from the 1969 recording, one from the Voyager Golden Record's mathematical sequence. These match, not approximately, exactly. The harmonic structure, the interval timing, the frequency modulation, they're identical down to the waveform characteristics. This lunar signal from 69 contains elements that wouldn't be formulated by human scientists for another 8 years. It's responding to something we hadn't created yet. Which leaves us with three options. 1. Statistical coincidence with odds of approximately 1 in 10 to the 47th power, essentially impossible. 2. Someone in 69 had access to information about what the Voyager team would create in 77, which implies either precognition or time travel. Or 3. And here Park's voice became very quiet, very careful. The signal didn't originate in 69. It originated now, or sometime after 77, and somehow propagated backward through time, which violates everything we understand about causality, but is technically permitted under certain interpretations of general relativity involving closed time-like curves, though we've never observed anything like that actually occurring in nature. Hayes leaned forward and offered a fourth option that no one wanted to consider, but everyone in that room was thinking. Or whoever sent this signal had access to human communications and human decision-making processes across multiple decades, monitoring our technological development with enough precision to know what we would put on those golden records 8 years before we launched them. The implications of that statement settled into the room like gravity, pulling everything toward a center that no one could quite look at directly. If something had been watching humanity closely enough to predict the specific contents of the Voyager mission with perfect accuracy in 1969, then the question wasn't whether we were alone in the universe. The question was how long we'd been observed, and what else they knew about us that we didn't know about ourselves. Owen spent the next week making calls to people who'd spent careers not making calls like this. He found Russell Klein, 68 years old, former National Security Agency signal analyst, retired in 2008, living in Virginia, and spending his retirement doing exactly what whistleblowers do, waiting for someone to ask the right questions so he could finally tell the truth about things he'd been ordered to keep quiet. Owen asked about Project Sentinel. Klein was silent for 10 seconds, the kind of silence that comes from deciding whether to cross a line drawn 50 years ago, and then he said yes, he'd worked on it, peripherally, in a support capacity during the early 70s. Sentinel wasn't about monitoring communications from space, Klein explained, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation in his head for decades. It was about monitoring communications from the moon, specifically from beneath the lunar surface. Between 69 and 72, Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 positioned their ALSEP instrument packages in a geometric configuration around Oceanus, Procellarum, and Mare Imbrium. The official reason was seismic monitoring, measuring moonquakes to understand lunar internal structure. The actual reason, at least the classified reason I was briefed on, was to create a detection array capable of triangulating electromagnetic sources from subsurface locations. They were building a listening network, and they were building it because Apollo 12 had detected something transmitting from beneath Mare Cognitum, and NASA wanted to know if it was isolated or if there were multiple sources across different lunar regions. Owen asked the obvious question: what did they find? Klein's answer was delivered with the flat affect of someone reporting data, rather than speculation. Multiple transmission points, at least 7 distinct sources across 4 lunar maria, all broadcasting variations of the same mathematical pattern, all originating from depths between 2 and 4 kilometers below the surface, all in regions with no seismic activity, no volcanic history for 3 billion years, no geological explanation for organized electromagnetic emissions. The analysis classified it as biological impossibility, structures that appeared artificial existing in an environment that couldn't support any known form of life or any known process of structure formation. The final recommendation from Sentinel, issued in '73, was suspension of all crewed lunar operations until origin could be determined. 6 months later, NASA announced the permanent cancellation of Apollo 18, 19, and 20. Budget constraints, they said. But the budget was approved. Congress had funding allocated through '75. That same week, through contacts in the international space community, Owen reached Valentina Kozlov, 74 years old, former Soviet cosmonaut who'd worked as mission specialist on the Luna robotic program during the '70s. She'd never flown to space herself, but she'd controlled rovers that had, directing them across the moon's surface from a command center outside Moscow. And she'd seen things in the telemetry data that made her ask questions nobody wanted to answer. When Owen explained what he'd found, the 69 signal, the Sentinel project, the pattern of subsurface transmissions, Valentina laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was the laugh of recognition, of finally having confirmation for something she'd suspected for 50 years. Luna 16, she said, landed in Mare Fecunditatis, September 1970, first robotic sample return. Before it launched back to Earth with the soil samples, it spent 14 hours conducting surface analysis, and during that time, it detected electromagnetic pulses from underground. Same frequency you describe, 1,420 megahertz. Same mathematical pattern, prime number sequences. We reported to Soviet Academy of Sciences. They classified it immediately, told us it was equipment error, solar interference. But Luna 20, February '72. Different landing site, same thing. Signals from below, organized patterns, impossible geology. And then the program changed direction, stopped going to those areas, started focusing on polar regions instead, places where the signals weren't detected. No official explanation, just new objectives. We were told to stop asking questions. Heejun's Marlene, continuing her archival excavation at Johnson Space Center, found a second document that had been misfiled in the Sentinel materials, a technical assessment dated March 15, 1973, bearing the signature of Werner von Braun, the architect of the Saturn V rocket, the man who'd made the moon achievable. The report was 3 pages, dense with technical language and careful qualification, but the final paragraph was clear enough. Recommend immediate suspension of crewed lunar operations until origin of subsurface transmission sources is determined through unmanned probe analysis. Signal demonstrates knowledge of human technological development timeline, extending minimally 8 years beyond point of detection. This represents either unprecedented breakthrough in terrestrial information security compromise or represents Category 5 contact event, with non-terrestrial intelligence possessing observation capabilities of human civilization across extended temporal periods. Either scenario requires comprehensive assessment before personnel are placed at potential risk. Current operational protocols are insufficient for scenarios involving entities with apparent foreknowledge of human activities. Category 5 contact event. The highest classification in the scale NASA had developed in the 60s for potential extraterrestrial encounters, the one reserved for confirmed interaction with intelligent non-human entities demonstrating technological capabilities exceeding human civilization, the one they'd never expected to actually use. Owen brought the documentation to Sienna Hartwell, 38 years old, professor of space history at Georgetown University, author of 2 books on the Apollo program's political and scientific legacy. The kind of historian who didn't just know the official narrative but understood the spaces between the official statements where the real story often lived. She spent 3 days reviewing everything: the 69 recording, the Sentinel materials, von Braun's assessment, the Soviet corroboration, and when she delivered her analysis, she brought charts and timelines and congressional budget documents that painted a picture nobody had assembled this completely before. Apollo 17, Sienna began, spreading documents across the conference table like evidence in a trial. Launched December 7th, 1972. Landed December 11th, departed December 14th. Last humans on the moon. Official narrative says the program ended due to budget constraints, diminishing public interest, shifting national priorities toward Skylab and the upcoming Space Shuttle program. But look at the actual numbers. In 1970, 71, and 72, Congress had approved NASA budgets that included full funding for Apollo 18, 19, and 20. The missions were planned, the hardware was built, the crew assignments were made. Apollo 18 was scheduled for July 73, landing site Copernicus Crater. Apollo 19 was September 73, Tycho Crater. Apollo 20 was May 74, Marius Hills. 3 missions, all approved, all funded, all ready. And then, in September 72, 3 months before Apollo 17 even launched, NASA Administrator James Fletcher announced the permanent cancellation of all remaining lunar missions. Not a postponement, a cancellation. The Saturn V rockets built for those missions were repurposed, turned into museum displays. The trained crews were reassigned. Nixon made a statement about how Apollo had achieved its scientific objectives, and it was time to focus on more practical goals. But here's what doesn't make sense. Of the 11 primary scientific objectives NASA had established for the Apollo program, 6 were still incomplete. Lunar seismic network deployment wasn't finished. Deep core sampling of multiple geological provinces wasn't done. Long-duration surface operations hadn't been tested. The program ended while it was still producing groundbreaking science, while Congress was still funding it, while the public was still watching. Something changed between the planning phase and September 72. Something made NASA decide that going back to the moon wasn't worth the risk anymore, even with missions already built and ready to fly. The pattern extended beyond institutional decisions into individual lives, and Owen documented it with the thoroughness of someone building a case. Of the 12 astronauts who walked on the moon between 69 and 72, 7 had made public statements about unexplained phenomena before their deaths. Careful statements that stopped just short of explicit claims, but were clear enough to anyone paying attention. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14, had spent his post-NASA career talking about consciousness and non-local phenomena, and the certainty that contact had occurred, though he never specified when or where. Pete Conrad, Apollo 12, had given an interview to a documentary filmmaker in early 1999 discussing events during lunar operations that remain classified for national security reasons. But he died in a motorcycle accident that July, 3 months before the scheduled interview was set to be recorded. The footage was never made. Harrison Schmitt, Apollo 17, the only professional scientist to walk on the moon, a geologist who should have spent his retirement discussing rock samples and crater formation, instead made cryptic statements in interviews about how our understanding of lunar history required substantial revision based on observations that couldn't be publicly discussed. Alan Bean, Apollo 12, spent his later years painting scenes from his lunar EVA with an intensity that suggested he was trying to capture something specific, something he couldn't articulate in words. When asked what he was trying to convey, he said he was painting what he remembered seeing, just past the edge of the floodlights, in the places the cameras didn't quite reach. None of these men were conspiracy theorists or attention seekers. They were test pilots, engineers, scientists, people trained to observe and report accurately, people whose entire careers depended on credibility. And all of them hinted at the same thing: something on the moon that wasn't in the official reports. Dr. Hayes brought new data to Owen's attention, information that shifted the story from historical mystery to active present concern. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, launched in 2009, had been mapping the moon's surface with unprecedented detail for 15 years, and buried in its technical data sets, the kind of raw telemetry that rarely made it into press releases or scientific papers, were electromagnetic anomalies detected in Oceanus Procellarum, the exact region where Apollo 12 had landed and where Conrad had first reported the subsurface signal. The anomalies appeared intermittently, usually for brief periods of 7 to 11 minutes, always at 1,420 megahertz, always following the same mathematical pattern: prime numbers 2 through 97, pause, repetition. NASA's official classification listed them as residual electrical activity from abandoned ALSEP equipment, interference from outdated instrumentation still sitting on the lunar surface, broadcasting random signals as its components degraded. But Hayes pulled up the shutdown records. The Apollo 12 ALSEP had been deliberately powered down in 1977 as part of a program-wide deactivation of lunar surface experiments, when budget cuts eliminated the ground stations needed to receive their data. The equipment had been off for 47 years. Dead electronics don't transmit structured mathematical sequences. Dead electronics don't broadcast on frequencies selected for interstellar communication. Dead electronics don't repeat patterns identical to signals detected 5 decades earlier. Owen tracked down Dr. Marcus Webb through academic connections and persistent investigation, finding him in a retirement community in New Mexico, 82 years old, still sharp, still following space news with the attention of someone who'd spent a career thinking about things most people never considered. Webb confirmed his participation in Project Sentinel, speaking with the measured, careful language of someone who'd signed non-disclosure agreements but had reached an age where the weight of secrets felt heavier than the weight of consequences. "We analyzed every possibility," Webb said over a video call, his face lined with age, but his eyes still carrying the analytical intensity of a physicist confronting data. Natural electromagnetic emissions from radioactive decay in subsurface minerals, resonance effects from the solar wind interacting with lunar regolith, some unknown property of the Moon's internal structure, generating organized signals through mechanisms we didn't understand. We tested every hypothesis. None of them fit. The signals were too organized, too consistent, too specifically mathematical. They demonstrated intentionality. They demonstrated structure. And they demonstrated knowledge, because that pattern, those specific primes, that exact pause interval, they encoded information about Earth's axial tilt, about our radio frequencies, about mathematical constants we use in our own communication systems. Something beneath the lunar surface knew what we would recognize as intelligent communication. The final assessment from Sentinel, the one von Braun signed, concluded high probability of artificial structures at depth. Age estimated minimum 50 million years based on crater formation chronology in the transmission regions, purpose unknown, origin unknown, but technological capability sufficient to monitor electromagnetic emissions from Earth across extended periods. We recommended against further crewed missions until we understood what we were dealing with. That recommendation was accepted. The Apollo program ended, and we haven't sent humans back in 52 years. Dr. Park called Owen on October 28, 2024, her voice carrying an urgency that overrode professional detachment. The LRO data had changed. The signal pattern detected from Oceanus Procellarum, which had been repeating the same prime sequence for years, had shifted 3 weeks earlier, on October 7th. It was no longer broadcasting prime numbers. It was broadcasting a countdown. Decreasing integers, one number per transmission cycle, dropping sequentially from 1,420. When she'd first noticed the change, the count was at 1,373. Now it was at 1,369. The signal was counting down one number approximately every 24 hours, which meant if it continued at this rate, it would reach zero in approximately 1,369 days, 3 years and 9 months from now. March 2028. And the countdown had started precisely 47 days ago, which placed its initiation on September 11th, 2024. The same week, NASA had announced the final crew assignments and confirmed landing site for Artemis 3, the mission that would return humans to the lunar surface for the first time since Apollo 17. The mission scheduled to land in Oceanus Procellarum, the exact location where Pete Conrad had stood 55 years earlier and heard something transmitting from below. Whatever was beneath the Moon, it had been quiet for decades, broadcasting the same pattern, waiting. And the moment humanity announced we were coming back, it started counting down. Owen submitted a formal inquiry to NASA's Office of Communications in early November, requesting comment on the 1969 transmission, on Project Sentinel, on the subsurface signals, on the current LRO detections and their potential connection to the Artemis 3 mission timeline. The response came 3 weeks later, 2 paragraphs of carefully constructed institutional language that acknowledged receipt of his inquiry, noted that historical mission audio undergoes periodic archival review, and some materials remain classified under national security protocols established during the Cold War era, and stated that current Artemis program landing site selection was based solely on scientific merit and optimal crew safety considerations with no connection to unverified historical anomalies. The letter was signed by an assistant administrator whose name appeared on hundreds of similar responses. The kind of bureaucratic deflection that said everything by saying nothing. When Owen followed up asking specifically whether NASA was aware of electromagnetic transmissions from Oceanus Procellarum, whether the Artemis 3 crew had been briefed on potential subsurface phenomena, whether the countdown pattern had been analyzed, he received no response at all. Just silence. the kind of silence that institutions deploy when questions get too specific, and answers would require admissions nobody wants to make. The Artemis 3 mission, as currently scheduled, would launch in September 2026, land 4 days later in Oceanus Procellarum, approximately 12 kilometers from the Apollo 12 landing site, and conduct 7 days of surface operations with a crew of 4 astronauts, 2 on the surface, 2 in lunar orbit. The mission objectives listed in public documents focused on establishing infrastructure for sustained lunar presence, testing new EVA suits, deploying scientific instruments for long-term monitoring, and conducting geological surveys of regions never explored by Apollo. Standard stuff. Ambitious but reasonable goals for humanity's return to the Moon after a 54-year absence. But the landing site selection had changed 3 times during mission planning. Initial proposals had targeted the lunar South Pole, regions with permanent shadow and potential water ice, the logical choice for building future lunar bases. Then it shifted to Aristarchus Plateau, a geologically interesting region with unusual spectral properties. And then, in the final mission design locked in September 2024, it moved to Oceanus Procellarum. The official justification cited optimal landing approach, geometry, and accessibility to diverse geological samples. No mention of Apollo 12. No mention of subsurface signals. No mention of anything that would suggest the crew was going there to investigate something rather than simply explore. What we know, assembled from 55 years of fragments and silence and careful documentation, forms a picture that's 80% complete, clear enough to understand the shape of what happened even if the details remain obscured. In November 1969, Apollo 12 detected structured electromagnetic transmission from beneath the lunar surface, mathematical patterns broadcasting at the frequency universally recognized as optimal for interstellar communication. The transmission demonstrated knowledge of human technological development extending years beyond the point of detection, responding to communication protocols we hadn't created yet, suggesting either observation capabilities we don't understand or temporal mechanisms that violate our comprehension of causality. NASA initiated Project Sentinel, deployed additional LSEP arrays across multiple Apollo missions to triangulate and analyze the phenomenon, confirmed multiple transmission sources across different lunar regions, all originating from depths of 2 to 4 kilometers in geologically inactive areas where nothing should exist except dead rock. The analysis concluded high probability of artificial structures, age measured in tens of millions of years, purpose unknown. The recommendation was suspension of crewed operations until origin could be determined. That recommendation was implemented. The Apollo program ended abruptly despite approved funding and completed hardware. Astronauts who witnessed these phenomena made careful statements about unexplained observations, but were never officially debriefed in public forums. The signals continued intermittently for decades, same pattern, same frequency, monitored by orbital assets, but never publicly disclosed. And then, in September 2024, 47 days after NASA announced Artemis 3 would return humans to Oceanus Procellarum, the signal changed from repetitive pattern to countdown sequence, currently at 1,341 days remaining, counting down to March 2028, 16 months after the planned Artemis 3 landing. What we don't know fills the 20% of this story that transforms it from historical curiosity into active mystery, with implications that extend beyond academic interest into questions about what we're walking into when we go back. We don't know what's transmitting or why. We don't know if the structures beneath the lunar surface are abandoned technology from a civilization that passed through our solar system millions of years ago, or if they're active installations still performing whatever function they were designed for. We don't know why they demonstrate knowledge of human communication before we developed it, whether that's observation, prediction, or something else entirely. We don't know what the countdown represents, whether it's a timer for some automated process, a warning, an invitation, or simply a signal that means nothing to us because we lack the context to interpret it correctly. We don't know if NASA's decision to return to that specific location is coincidence, scientific interest, or something more deliberate, whether the Artemis 3 crew knows what they're being sent to investigate, or if they're walking into this blind, trusting that the agency has their safety as the priority. And we don't know what happens when that countdown reaches 0 in March 2028, whether it's the end of a sequence or the beginning of something else. Owen sat alone in Archive Vault C7 on a Friday afternoon in late November, the original magnetic tape of Pete Conrad's transmission resting in its archival box on the table in front of him, and thought about the Fermi paradox, the question that has haunted astronomy since Enrico Fermi asked it in 1950. If the universe is so vast, so old, so filled with billions of stars and potentially billions of planets, where is everybody? The paradox assumes we're searching, looking outward, scanning the cosmos for signals we haven't found, convinced we're alone because the evidence of others hasn't reached us yet. But what if the assumption is wrong? What if they've been here, not recently but anciently, not visiting but building, leaving installations beneath the surface of our own moon, waiting in the deep time of geology while species rise and fall on the planet they're watching? What if the moon isn't just our natural satellite, a dead rock caught in our gravity, but something else, a marker, a monument, a listening post established when Earth was young and life was simple, and nothing here had developed the capability to look up and wonder what was looking back? The Great Filter, the theoretical barrier that prevents civilizations from spreading across the galaxy, usually gets discussed as something ahead of us, some challenge we haven't faced yet that will determine whether humanity survives to become a spacefaring species. But what if it's already behind us? What if we passed it without knowing? And what's waiting beneath Oceanus Procellarum is the notification that we've reached the threshold where silence ends and contact begins. Dr. Webb, in his last conversation with Owen before declining further interviews, offered a final observation that carried the weight of 40 years spent thinking about questions most people never consider. Pete Conrad saw something that day in '69, Webb said, his voice quiet but certain. All the Apollo astronauts saw things, heard things, reported things that never made it into the official transcripts. They were trained observers, methodical, skeptical, not prone to flights of imagination. If they said something was there, something was there. And now we're going back. The question isn't whether we'll find something. The question is whether we're ready for what that something has been waiting 55 years to show us. Because that countdown didn't start when we detected it. It started when we announced we were returning. As if it was waiting for us. As if it knew we'd come back eventually. As if everything that's been sitting beneath that lunar dust for millions of years was installed specifically for the moment when we'd be developed enough, curious enough, brave enough to go looking for answers to questions we didn't even know we were asking. The countdown continues. 1,341 days remaining. Artemis 3 launches in 22 months. And somewhere beneath the sea of storms, 2.7 kilometers down in rock, that hasn't moved since the Cretaceous period ended, and the dinosaurs died, and the first primates began their long evolution toward becoming the species that would eventually build rockets and return to the place where something has been waiting, patiently, in the absolute silence of vacuum and stone, for the day we'd finally arrive and hear what it's been trying to tell us since before we existed to listen.